welcome everybody to our fifth episode already of GLC Face to Face, our coffee break on digital learning. Our topic today is the dimension of equality for education in times of crisis and beyond. And as I said, it's our fifth episode of the Global Learning Council's former GLC Face-to-Face. The Global Learning Council, just a brief introduction, is a think tank of thought leaders on digital education. And we are doing this as one of our activities right now. We have two guests today. Let me start with Sajitha. Sajitha is from the World Bank Group. She is advisor in the office of the Global Director of Education there, and she's also responsible for the work on digital skills at World Bank. Welcome, Sajitha.
Thank you.
And our second guest today is Rahim Rajan. He's Deputy Director for Postsecondary Success at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Welcome, Rahim.
Thank you.
So to start with, I think we need a bit of explanation to our audience what your organizations are doing in the field of digital education. Maybe starting with you, Sajitha. What is the World Bank doing in this field?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks for inviting me also. Well, the World Bank is actually the largest financier in the field of education. Not many people know that, but it supports education projects to the tune of about $3 billion a year. It has a total portfolio, education portfolio of $16 billion. And we invest or support programs in about 80 countries in low-income, middle-income countries. And we work from early childhood up to tertiary education and scientific research. Specifically relating to digital learning, however, I have to say that this has been a bit more recent for us, obviously. We have been engaged in technology programs in education, but as you know, there's been a lot of problems with how technology is incorporated into public education systems, and we work almost entirely with public education systems. So there's problems of capacity, procurement, and so on. But since about a year and a half ago, we are focusing now on digital skills in particular as a part of that, as an explicit skill area. And this has come because the bank has adopted a holistic digital economy approach and is focusing on developing the digital economy in Africa, in Asia, and so on. And digital skills is considered one of the foundational pillars. So we are expanding the scope of our work in digital learning and digital skills, but we have been investing in EdTech as such for quite a few years. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Rahim, what does Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation do in this field?
Yes, so thank you very much, Christian. Sajitha, pleasure to be here with both of you. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation obviously operates multiple strategies. We have two kind of broad strategies in education focused in the United States. One is focused on improving equity and outcomes in K-12 education, so primary and secondary education, ensuring that low-income students and students of color, essentially graduate secondary school and enroll in post-secondary. And then the second strategy is on post-secondary. I'm on the post-secondary strategy, and our focus is to make sure that low-income students and students of color not only enter higher education in the United States, but that they graduate and succeed with credentials that have value, right? So it's not enough just to succeed. I think, over the last decade in the US, there's been a reform movement around improving the success of students in post-secondary. And I think we're now moving towards what we're calling equitable completion. So how do we make sure students not only graduate, but that they're graduating with credentials that have value in the labor market? In terms of our investments in digital learning, both in K-12 and in post-secondary, it's been very much focused on teaching and learning. So very much focused on ensuring students have access to high quality digital curriculum, and that they are supports for faculty and institutions to deliver high quality, in our case, mainly blended, hybrid instruction. Particularly in post-secondary, we're focused on the general education high enrollment courses. So these are the introductory courses, like your introduction to biology course, introduction to chemistry, introduction to psychology. These courses tend to be the gateway course into the degree pathway. And oftentimes we find that there's disproportionately negative outcomes for students of color and low-income students. So our approach has been trying to move passive lecture-based classes to more hybrid, blended, and active pedagogies in those courses.
Thank you. Before we dive into today's topic, let me just briefly give your audience an impression what we are doing here. It's just the first 20 minutes, so about 13 minutes left for discussion among the three of us. And afterwards, for the last 10 minutes, the discussions is dedicated to your questions. So please feel free to use the Q&A tool in the panel here to give us your questions, and we will give you the forum in the end and answer your questions here. Before we get to the global perspective of equality in education, let me start by asking you about the current situation in the US, since you're both based in the US, in Seattle and in Washington, DC. Help us understand how the situation is evolving there, not only with COVID-19, but also with the Black Lives Matters movement, and what role education and the access to education plays in the discussions around that. Rahim, maybe we can start with you.
Okay, I'm happy to start. So first of all, with COVID-19, I think we've seen a dramatic, almost disruption of the way education has been delivered. So both in our primary and secondary schools, and also in post-secondary, we've seen a dramatic shift from in-person education, and I'd say depending on the place and the sector and the system, kind of uneven progress in moving to digital. In some cases, you have institutions that have made that transition very smoothly. And in other places, oftentimes depending on resources, depending on preparation, depending on kind of the organization itself, that transition has been challenging. So I would say even in post-secondary, you see some colleges that made that shift in a very dynamic and a very smooth way, and other colleges that are still struggling. One thing that just put it into context, I think there's something like 22 states in the country where they are still not even mandated to provide remote instruction. Something like almost half the students in K-12 live in these states. So the effects of what we're going through right now in terms of the continuity of learning, in terms of what kinds of loss of learning are we going to see, is pretty profound. In the US, there's a lot of discussion about kind of what are we going to see in the fall based on fall enrollments in post-secondary, depending on the situation with the virus, and whether campuses will be able to open up and have in-person classes, or whether they will be shifting to hybrid and online environments in the fall. Obviously, regarding the Black Lives Matter, I think what I would say is that the inequities in this country are not new. And so, African-American communities have historically faced decades, if not centuries, of oppression. And the march of progress continues, but there are still very large obstacles that impede the success of those individuals from having an equal life and a valued life. And, you know, whether we think about housing, whether we think about capital, education, healthcare, we see both with COVID, the exacerbation of these inequities, but we also see other injustices that are still roiling in our society: criminal justice, policing, violence towards African Americans. These issues are not new issues, but they are continuously coming to light. And I think that, you know, we are in a moment of profound change in this country. And I think the virus is exacerbating many of those inequities, but also, you know, forcing some of those changes to come to light, and the need for those changes to come to light.
Sajitha, how do you perceive the situation?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the World Bank doesn't work on the United States as such. It is definitely, you know, committed to opposing racism and discrimination of any form. So, you know, what I'm saying here is a little bit my own observations, and you see very clearly. In fact, I did a presentation for another group, and this was before the recent protests broke out, and it was really striking that the COVID cases, and especially the mortality, how highly correlated it is with geographic regions and zip codes that are poor and vulnerable. So you hear about the New York numbers, but actually if you go down to the specifics, you can compare the zip codes where there was the highest mortality rates and the CDC vulnerability index, and you will see the high degree of correlation. And this, one sees that the mortality rates are much higher amongst the African Americans, amongst the Hispanic population. And this is partly because of the living conditions, partly because of the kind of work they're doing. They are the frontline workers in many cases, in health, in deliveries, and so on. And they don't have health insurance in many cases, or adequate health insurance. They have a lot of comorbidities. So this explosion you see is a reflection of these inequalities that COVID-19 brought out very dramatically. And as far as education is concerned, I think what struck me was that even in a highly interconnected society like the US with high levels of broadband connectivity, the number of schools and students who struggled to get online learning or remote learning of any kind was astonishing, you know, compared to, let's say, China or Korea and so on, once they started coming back up online. And again, you know, very deep socioeconomic inequalities, teachers not knowing how to teach, and the lack of digital skills and devices among students. So the learning losses are not going to be evenly spread. They're going to be, you know, very unequal, and that's another source of frustration for people. A lot of the remote learning relied on parents supporting the children, and poor parents and those who have lower levels of education and those who have to go out to work, they're not able to support their kids, whereas it stands to reason the higher, more educated parents could obviously support their kids. So I think COVID-19 has brought out some very interesting challenges for all of those engaging in digital learning also.
Do you see a window of opportunity here to tackle those?
Well, I think the window of opportunity is that there's perhaps an acceptance that this may be part of the new normal. So a kind of cultural shift, you know, in terms of attitudes and so on, amongst educators, amongst planners, amongst, you know, administrators and so on. And at least I think that's happening in the US, but it's definitely happening worldwide. Now, one has to take that cultural shift to the next level to actually bridge the inequality gap. And I'll be happy to talk about that later if there's a question on that.
Yeah, I think if there is an opportunity, again, mainly from my perspective of what's happening in the US, it's the realization that, you know, access to, whether it's the internet, or reliably fast internet, you know, high-speed internet, or whether it's access to capable devices, whether it's access to, you know, instruction, you know, instructors that have been trained in delivering effective digital learning. I think these things are beginning to be realized as must-haves rather than nice-to-haves, especially in this environment. And I think many institutions, whether they were schools, districts, colleges, or systems of colleges, are beginning to realize that this is something they must prioritize and invest in. And maybe we're even going to see bold action at the federal level in the US, where they begin to make more investments in enabling colleges to have some of those capabilities and infrastructure, because I think it's very challenging for each school or district or college to develop that infrastructure independently. It's very expensive and it's very hard. So I think there's a realization that, you know, this is now part of the playing field for colleges and schools to deliver effective instruction in this environment. They need those tools, they need those capabilities, and we can't just leave them each to develop those themselves. We need to provide supports. And so I think, at least in this context, I think there's a reprioritization of the importance of digital learning.
We switch to a global perspective now. If you compare the situation in the US with other regions of the world, and in terms of equality, maybe also the poorer ones, the poorer regions of the world, how are they coping with the crisis? How do they cope with the rapid shift to online teaching and learning and the access to education?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that the majority of countries were completely unprepared. And, you know, if you leave aside some of the East Asian countries like China and Korea and Japan, Singapore, and so on, most of the other countries were, including countries that I would say are more digitally savvy, like India, were really very unprepared. And this is partly because, of course, the lockdown was very sudden, and you know, it was almost from one day to the other. But and there hadn't been systematic preparation. And I think that's going to be a crucial issue as we move forward with crises of climate change and environmental sustainability and so on. These issues are going to become more prominent. We found, for instance, and there's no, you know, hard data on every country, but we found that most countries had to switch to traditional forms of distance learning, TV, radio, even sending printed materials and so on, just because even though, you know, mobile phone access may be there, people didn't have devices, or the content wasn't there, the digital skills wasn't there, and you know, they didn't have data packages also to access this. So this was a big problem, even in higher education, even in a digitally savvy country like Kenya. I think the figure was about 25 to 40% of students and teachers didn't have devices, let alone data packages and so on. Many countries don't have LMS, you know, and they don't have content in the vernacular especially. So this inequality is going to be a huge problem. So much so that many universities and countries had to take the decisions that they couldn't organize assessments or examinations, because how do you organize an assessment if some students have not been able to cover the content, and therefore they've had to take stopgap measures to let those students go ahead and so on, but let them catch up. So these are very operational problems, which I hope we'll be able to help countries with.
Okay. Before I give you my next question, oh no, there's Anna already with questions from the audience. And if I may,
yes,
I do still have one. The changes that universities are undergoing right now globally, how sustainable do you think they are? how sustainable is the transition to digital learning right now?
Should I answer, or would you like?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead first?
Yeah.
And then I'll
Okay. So I think they're sustainable in one way, at least at the post-secondary level, at the tertiary level. You have, much more engaged students. In fact, what we found is that the students knew more than the teachers in many cases and could help them. And so I think the move to using a lot of e-learning modalities is going to accelerate at the tertiary level. But I think the crucial question of, is it going to fundamentally change how education is structured? I don't think that shift has yet occurred. It's still, how do I get through the exam, or how do I, pass this? And in that sense, I don't think there has been a fundamental shift. But the shift to online learning or different types of learning, I think that is a sustainable shift, definitely. And I think governments are more prepared, will be more prepared. I think another area, and this is my last point, is an acceptance of much greater collaboration across countries, especially in the area of science, because what we saw was this tremendous collaboration from the time the virus was identified to just, finding out its genome sequence, the race for the vaccine and so on. So that collaboration is going to also stay.
I think from my perspective, I think a lot depends on the ability for whether they're individual institutions or regional configurations or systems to collaborate. And so I think, for example, there's baseline infrastructure that colleges need to invest in. So making sure that their students have access to devices, to internet, et cetera. Like in the United States, we're a very affluent country. There's still more than 21 million individuals that don't have access to reliable internet. So even in a very affluent context, we have many citizens that are disconnected and don't have access to the baseline technologies. Having said that, I do think that the pandemic is forcing a shift in practice. Many faculty, something like 50% of the faculty in the US had never taught a blended or an online course before. And because of the pandemic, they were essentially forced to migrate to a digital kind of modality. And I think, for many of those faculty, they will still find it to be suboptimal or, not satisfying. But I think for many faculty, and it'll be interesting to understand, like, where does this trend go? I think many faculty might begin to see what are the opportunities of these new modalities and what are the things that are possible, and for students, many students who have very busy lives, digital is actually an opportunity for access. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, do faculty invest in building their skills to deliver more effective pedagogy online? Do institutions help students understand, what are the skills that students need to be effective online learners? So there's a set of things I think that colleges need to do to deliver a better educational experience online that I think they are now waking up to, that those things are a requirement. They're not optional. They are essentially mandatory in order for us to have, high quality digital learning experiences.
I'm just gonna jump in with some questions. So let me just start off with a first one to Sajitha. Which measures in the context of digital skills are particularly important, and what would be your priorities?
Is this for me?
This is for you, yes.
Yeah, I think digital skills, one of the issues we saw is that people don't have a clear understanding of what is meant by digital skills. And therefore, actually having a framework for, determining the competences and the proficiency levels is actually an important thing. And we have suggested that the UNESCO Digital Literacy Framework, which is in turn based on the European Union's DigComp framework, is a good place to start. And if you look at that, there's several competencies and proficiency levels, and it's hard to say which specific competencies are more important than the others, but definitely things like the ability to retrieve information, to assess its quality, to communicate, to collaborate, and all that would be very important skills. And the best would be if everybody had, in developing countries, at least the foundational level of these skills. And of course, these skills have to go along with numeracy and literacy skills, and socio-emotional skills, which many people don't have at the moment. So our struggle is actually to ensure that digital skills becomes part of the repertoire of total skills that young people need in a new information society.
Thank you. Rahim, I also have a question for you. Is there a point along this education chain that you mentioned where inequality is most pronounced, and has this point shifted during COVID? So if now students are being taught online, has this become more of a problem for maybe K-12 rather than university students?
Yeah, I wish the inequalities and the inequities were not so acute across the full spectrum. I think what's challenging is that we have different inequities at different junctures, right? So with, for example, like within K-12, many systems, many districts, they instituted remote instruction, online instruction, but as Sajitha implied, many students, primary school students, secondary school students, if they're at home and they are unsupervised, their parents are working, they might be frontline essential workers, it's very challenging for students to, at that age, to just sit in front of a computer and kind of be an autodidact and go online and kind of manage their own instruction. And we have to remember that even teachers in K-12 are oftentimes managing their own personal situation at home while they're trying to deliver instruction. So it's been very challenging, I think, for schools to deliver that kind of remote instruction. There's another challenge though also, which is that, what if you don't have access to the technology or the bandwidth or the essential infrastructure, right? So I think, the former scenario implied that someone has access, but many students don't have access. They don't have the devices, they don't have the internet access. So even if they have the supervision at home, they literally cannot get online. And that, that's a profound challenge. There's other challenges though also which have to do with the transition. So this summer, many students are, finishing high school in the US, and they will be transitioning to post-secondary, but the nature of that transition is very uncertain in terms of kind of what college experience am I going to receive, in terms of the uncertainty about the virus. So I think there's enormous complexities, and students were seeing that. They're very uncertain about what are they going to do in the fall. Are they going to take a gap year? Are they going to attend a local institution when they previously would have traveled somewhere else in the country to attend a different kind of institution? So there's enormous uncertainties because, at least in the United States, it's very clear that we are still struggling with just, containing the vaccine. I think, other inequities we see is that some of the systems that were set up to help address some of these inequities are also challenged. So in the United States, public libraries have historically been a place where students could go and access the internet, have access to technology, have access to materials. Many of our public libraries are not functioning, at least physically. Colleges have actually had to set up, buses with Wi-Fi to enable people to have access to internet because they don't have internet at home. So there's all kinds of things that are happening, but the inequities are pretty fierce, and I fear that we're going to see tremendous harm to the most vulnerable student populations as a result of this pandemic.
And maybe since we're already at the end already of this episode, maybe just one last question. What would the one aspect be that we should take home from this session to keep in mind while tackling this crisis?
I think that what we have to consider is that, digital access, internet access, and having a device should probably be considered now a kind of human right, if I may say so. And even if it's not a device per student, it could be at least at the household level, so that they have access also to health information, and it can help with disaster preparedness and so on. And it could help with some form of learning too. So while we need to put in other aspects of this ecosystem, like enough content and digital training of the teachers and management of the system, at least if this is recognized as fundamental as having a school building and, teachers and so on, that's probably one of the key takeaways that I would emphasize.
Rahim, what would your takeaway be?
Yeah, I think I painted a very gloomy picture, but I think one thing I would say is that this is a moment of opportunity for real leadership. So whether it's leadership at a national level, whether it's leadership at an institutional level, whether it's leadership in a classroom, I think that, the thing that I didn't say, which I think is worth saying, is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of individuals really taking leadership roles and innovating, creating exciting and engaging digital learning experiences for students, and really asserting a vision of what is possible in the midst of these challenges. And I think that that's a lesson, that's a lesson that, like, no matter how challenging the situation is, human innovation can get us very far, right? And so collaborations amongst institutions, individuals investing and deepening their skills and capabilities, and whether it's a state or a district or systems investing in that infrastructure, these are things that can be done, right? So I think there is opportunity for innovation and for improvement of that experience.
Good to hear. Okay, thank you. Thanks to the two of you for joining us today. Thanks for everybody who attended this episode. After this one, we will take a short break. We'll not come back in 2 weeks, but a bit later this time. Please check our Twitter. You can also join us for a discussion on global learning on our Mattermost channel. We will share the link here in the chat. And I have to say goodbye to all our attendees and to the both of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sajitha.
Yeah, thank you, Rahim. Goodbye to everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.